I don't think that you can really understand deep questions about what language is unless you use it in very practical situations and engage with it. You understand how it works in real life.
The purpose of language is to organize a society. To say that different kinds of society can have different level of details captured in the language.
Language is absolutely central to achieving that kind of common sense making. The content of it, actually what is conveyed, what we have in common, could be different from culture to culture.
Welcome. So Professor Nick, can you maybe introduce yourself first?
Sure. I'm Nick Enfield and I'm Professor of Linguistics in the School of Humanities at the University of Sydney.
Can you elaborate, what is linguistics? What do you learn exactly there?
Well, linguistics is a very broad field. So the basic idea of linguistics is that you're learning about human language in general, which means that you're learning Spanish and Japanese and various different languages. You do that in a language department. But linguistics is really trying to understand what is the nature of human language by comparison to, for example, other animal communication systems. And so that means looking at how different languages are structured and comparing them, or looking at how children learn language, or looking at how language is used in everyday life. So there's many areas that a person could study in linguistics. For me personally, I studied a number of different areas. My field specialized on languages of mainland Southeast Asia. So I work especially in Laos and other nearby countries to look at the languages of that part of the world, especially the underrepresented languages, so the indigenous small languages, the languages that haven't been written down. With my students and on my own, I've been working on those languages not only to find out about their structures and the kinds of sounds that they use and so forth, but also how they're used in society.
Are there any interesting pattern that you see in different parts of the world, how they evolve their language?
Well, many interesting patterns, yes. Find that languages can vary a lot. They can change very much in terms of how. So some basic structure, for example, the order of the words can be the same in two languages or can be quite different. So in English you have a subject and then a verb and then an object. You might say, I saw a dog. Mm-hmm. So I is the subject. Another language might have the verb at the end. So I, a dog, saw. So maybe Japanese would be like that, or, for example, American Sign Language would be like that. So there are many different ways in which a language can be organized, and part of what we learn is that if you look at the languages of the world, there's maybe 6,000 or 7,000 different languages. If you look at them, that the patterns are very many, they show many possibilities, but there is some tendencies that linguists can try to understand. So for example, while you can have, I just said subject, verb, object, you have three things and they can be in that order. And if you swap around all the possible orders, you have 6 different kinds of orders, and most languages are not. It's not the case that all of these 6 orders are represented equally across the languages of the world. Most languages will have the subject before the verb and not after the verb. For example, that would be one example tendency that we've found across languages.
Do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think there is a reason why they have specific patterns like that?
It's not a coincidence. Mm-hmm. So there could be a number of different reasons. One would be that languages have a similar structure because they actually descend from a same language in the past. So you might say, well, Dutch and German are 2 different languages, but actually they're very similar in structure because they descended from the same language not long ago in history. And if you go further back, well, actually English is also related to them, and Spanish is also related to them if you go back in time to a common ancestor. So sometimes languages are similar because they descend from the same language in the past, similar to why 2 people might look similar because they have family in common. But another reason with language is that certain types of structure in language are easier to learn or easier to understand when you're using them. So if I'm talking about some event it's natural to say what is involved. So there's me and there's a dog, and then you say what happened. Or I saw the dog. So there's often a natural order of things, and that means that when languages develop over time, they tend to prefer certain structures, and that would explain why most languages would put the subject first in the sentence rather than, for example, at the end.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. But before like getting into like very specific things, maybe we can get to know you better first.
Sure.
You're studying a very niche subject, in my opinion, and I would like to know, why do you get into this field? Like, are there any moments in your life that makes you think, oh, I want to study linguistics, or do you have parents that study linguistics and so on?
That's an interesting question. I would not think of linguistics as a niche subject, but I completely understand why you'd say that. In fact, when you have your own expertise, you feel that everything is all about, for example, all about language. So to me, language is everywhere, and everybody's using it, and it's a universal sort of subject. But if you look at, for example, the size of the different departments in a university, the linguistics department is very small compared to most other departments. Why I got into it, it goes back, I guess, to when I was a kid, and I enjoyed traveling very much. I enjoyed like thinking about other countries, looking at the atlas. I used to have a beautiful big atlas, and I would sit down and look through this book and imagine these other countries. So I dreamt about traveling a lot, and then when I was able to do that, of course, you immediately encounter other languages. That's, if you want to participate in life in another, want to engage with people, obviously you have to learn the language if they don't know your language. So this just interested me, and that I kind of began to specialize. And I guess I had a knack for learning language and thinking about language. And of course, once you begin studying something, then it just builds. It's like a snowball, and you invest your time in studying that, and then it becomes more and more. So over time, it became what I do.
I see. But I guess what you're studying is more like the structure of the language, and what I like to put it as like a philosophy behind the language. And are you always like interested in like that like side of the language, or do you start from like a more concrete side, like learning like very specific things?
Well, I think that if you're thinking about structure of language, that's actually already quite concrete. So if you want to learn how to speak a language that you don't know, then you need to learn structure, but you will do it in a very concrete way. So you will learn sentences like, where is the bookstore, or can I have some food, or some very concrete sentences. When you do that, every time you learn a new sentence, you're learning a new structure. So structure, I think, is actually very concrete. But then you mentioned kind of philosophy of language and some sort of higher level questions about language. That is not concrete. That's really much more abstract. And I think that I like to think about language on both of those levels at the same time. So I don't think that you can really understand deep questions about what language is unless you use it in very practical situations and engage with it, and you understand how it works in real life. So in my field, I've been lucky to work with people who are very interested in, let's say, deep theoretical questions of language, but at the same time wanting to answer those questions by what we call going into the field. So spending time in communities that use languages and learning to speak them rather than just finding out random facts about the languages. So I think it's important to really combine concrete, practical experience with language with kind of deep theoretical questions about it.
I see. And besides studying about linguistics, I believe you also make a lot of publications. You are book authors. So can you tell us how many books you have written so far? I believe it's a lot.
Sure. So, of course, as an academic, like any other academic, I write reports on my research, and we publish our work in journals, scientific papers, and so forth. So anybody who's been an academic for a long time has at least publications. Books maybe not as much. So if you're working in, I don't know, medicine or something like that, maybe it's less common to write books. It's more common to publish kind of scientific articles and technical papers. In my kind of general area, which is arts and humanities and social sciences, people do write books a little bit more often. I mean, myself, I've been involved in many book projects, and there's, I guess, two kinds. One kind is what we call an edited book, where we bring together a group of researchers or scholars to write about a certain topic and invite people to write chapters, and somebody will edit that work and bring it together as a book. I've probably been involved in maybe 20 of those types of projects. And then there are books that we write all by ourselves, and I've probably been involved in maybe 12 of those. So many of them written by myself, but a few times I've written with co-authors. So, for example, I've written 2 books with Jack Sidnell, who's a professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto, and it is a very enjoyable experience to write with another researcher who kind of shares ideas and helps you to develop them. But I guess in the background, what I'm doing when I'm writing research articles is thinking about, well, how can I bring them together to summarize the findings of some research into book form, because then a book is, I think, easier to digest for people. So to summarize, there are different ways in which we can communicate our research to people, and I suppose what I've tried to do is do all of these things together so that some of my work is reaching a more technical audience and some of my work is reaching a broader audience, or perhaps even a public audience.
Yeah, I think like layman people like me would have like a really hard time just like reading a really technical paper on any subject. Yeah, and so your book is not just a summary of your work, you're also like looking into other researchers' work and like compiling it into one, is it?
That's right. So some of the work that I've done in book form has been really about summarizing my own research projects. And when we do that, we do cite and talk about other people's work. It's important to acknowledge other people's work and to relate what we've found to what other people have found. So it's scholarly in that sense. But with some books, the purpose is really to summarize a research program and a set of research findings. I've done a couple of books that are more general. They're more for a general audience. So when I say general, I mean not for academic readers, and more for general public. And with that kind of book, it's not necessarily about summarizing my own research, but more about trying to explain a kind of an overarching idea. So my last book that was like that was published in 2022, and the book's called Language versus Reality. The subtitle is Why Language is Good for Lawyers and Bad for Scientists. And so that about my research, but it was also very much about other research that I'm bringing together from different parts of the world and different sort of disciplines. And the idea of a book like that is to try to explain to people something about language that they might not be thinking about. So in that case, the idea was language is actually not very good at coding experience or capturing facts. The point was language is quite biased and quite designed for guiding people and influencing people and even manipulating people. Although when we use language, we don't think like that. We feel like language is transparent.
Right. So you mentioned that language is good for lawyers and bad for scientists in one of your books. And do you think those people who are taking advantage of language are doing it like willingly, knowingly? They're manipulating like the flaws of the language, or do you think they just go with how the language is already used by their society?
I think both things are true. So in terms of in some ways, we don't really have a choice with language as to how we package our ideas. So if right now we're speaking in English, and that means that we have to accept a whole lot of words and idioms and phrases that have been designed in some sense by other people through history. So there's a lot of baggage and a lot of information that's coded in English that we have no choice but to use that. That's the system that we're using when we speak English. And so I'm not going to kind of think too much about the history of the language when I'm just using it to have a conversation, right? And children learn language perfectly well without understanding where all the ideas came from. So it means that they're accepting certain terms without questioning them or thinking about it at all. But on the other hand, when we use language, we don't just use single words. We make up new sentences and we phrase things in unique ways, and we can be very creative with language. So that means that at any point we do have control over the things we say and how we say them, and often we're trying to influence other people. In fact, that's almost always what we're trying to do when we use language. We're trying to influence other people in one way or another, so to guide them in some way, to help them, draw their attention to something, inform them of things, or we might be manipulating them in some negative way. So whether you're helping someone or taking advantage of them, language is partly determining what you have to work with, but on the other hand, you then have to be creative with those resources. So in the book I say that we're both made by language and played by language, which means that played by language means that the language plays us in some sense, that the language sets the rules for what we can do. But then once we are in that game in some sense, then we can take control and be creative. One more thing I want to say, I think it's a great question that you ask about whether we're aware or not, and I've been focusing on people who speak and people who produce language. Of course, the other side is people who listen and people who try to understand what others are saying. We can effortlessly understand sentences in the languages that we know, but if we are too sort of effortless about it, it means we don't introspect, we don't reflect, we don't think mindfully about what someone has said and how they've said it. So that book is a lot about trying to promote the idea of using language more mindfully, which means paying attention more to make when they describe things or when they say things, because there's always many other ways they could say it. So if you're a little bit more conscious or mindful about how language can be a tool in a way for influence, then you can overcome that sense of being swept along by language and rather take a little bit more control.
If someone were to be conscious of their language, are there any guidelines or tricks that they can use to be more objective?
Well, I think the first thing would be that a general sense of kind of thinking critically, and that means studying what you are trying to understand, paying attention to what you're trying to understand. So if you're trying to be more mindful about language, then you need to pay closer attention to it. That's the sort of first step, and think about, okay, the way people said things, they could have said it a different way. What were the options and why didn't they use them? So first sort of part of it is to really become more informed in some sort of sense. And then the second thing is, I think there are no general. Often people ask me what's a tip or a trick language, and it's not that kind of thing. With language is very flexible, very dynamic, very nuanced, and it's a very fine tool. So there's no general kind of tricks or tips with language, because every action that you create in language is very specific to a certain context. So it's really like with many complex skills, like music, for example, it just takes so much practice. Now, we all have massive amount of practice with language. We talk all day, in the morning, noon and night. We've spent our whole lives talking, so we're all very practiced. But at a certain point, we just use this thing reflexively, and we don't necessarily consciously think about what we're doing. So that, I think, is the main thing, is to really introspect about language, pause from time to consider what you've said or what someone else has said and why they've said it in that particular way.
Right. So deliberate practice over and over again, that's the only way to shape your language to be more objective.
Well, yeah, you said objective. I don't think so. Objective is an interesting kind of goal to have. I wouldn't say that language can ever be truly objective, because that language is always giving you one angle on something. So a very strong example of this would be to say, okay, imagine somebody who has a rocket launcher, and they fire this rocket launcher into a truck that has people inside the truck, and they blow it up. What are we going to call this person? All right, are they a terrorist or are they a freedom fighter? Two very different descriptions of this person. And we might say, well, I don't know what to call them because I need more information, and then we can talk about the situation. But in the end, with any situation like that, people will have very different views depending on who they affiliate with, aspects of their background, information about the context. So objectivity is on a first pass, objectivity is very hard to achieve. I think what's really important for achieving something close to objectivity is to get much more information and describe something in as many different ways as possible. Okay, so if we can describe the facts of what I just talked about, there's a person, there's a rocket launcher, the rocket launcher was fired, there was an explosion, people died, these things all happened, and we can agree on that. But then a lot of what language is about is actually trying to not be objective, but trying to influence the other person and how they should be thinking about this scene that I've just described. So most of what we talk about is really adding some subjective kind of component. So if we study the way we talk and if we think about the way we talk, we can begin to identify which parts of what we say are simply describing facts, if you like, although that's always, if you keep drilling down, you find that facts are sort of subjectively described as well. Mm-hmm. But you can try by thinking and carefully studying how we use language to distinguish between the more objective aspects and those aspects which are very subjective and very focused on trying to get people to take the same position as you. So if I say this terrorist blew up a truck, what I'm saying is that someone blew up a truck and I want to give you an instruction for how to think about that person. They're bad, they're sowing chaos, etc. And it's the opposite way around with a freedom fighter blew up a truck, right? So objectivity is often not really our goal when we're using language, but it's clearly our goal when we are doing science, and that's the subtitle of the book. That's why I've argued that language is not well suited to science, precisely because it's so inherently subjective.
I see. And does that statement that language is inherently subjective apply to any kinds of language? For example, what about math? You can argue that math is some kind of language, but it's used in physics and like sciences.
Yeah, I wouldn't really call mathematics a language in the sense that I've been currently describing, but that maybe I'd be more willing to call computer languages, like the kinds of languages that you would write code in, right? So let's assume anyway that we could call maths a language. It is certainly objective, I think, in some important kinds of ways, because it's not really conveying what's good or bad. You finish a maths problem where 2 + 2 is 4. There's nothing good or bad about it. You're just stating a fact. And I think that it has to be possible to be objective using those kinds of schemes, which are essentially really about managing information in some kind of way. The thing is that a lot of as children, when we learn language, maths is way off in the future for like a 3-year-old child, right? You're not really learning any maths at all, but you're very intensively learning language at that age. And so the foundations of language for any given person are really fundamentally in the social functions, the kind of subjective functions, the functions of influencing others using language as a tool and so on. And when you get older, then you can really pull out some underlying core of that and say, okay, well, we can use some of these basic informational systems of language, subjects and predicates and things like that, to build objective systems for information processing. So that may be code or maths or what have you.
I see. And so if you say that the purpose of language is like to organize a society, would you say that like different kinds of society can have like different level of details captured in the language? You think so?
Yeah, I would say that. But I think when we say different kinds of societies, usually we're thinking at a very high level, like is this a democracy or is this a monarchy or is this hunter-gatherer society? I mean, we're talking about high-level organization of a culture or a social system in a large population. But I think that if you look at language and how it's used, you're talking about social structure at a very much finer level or a lower level, as we might say. So what I mean is it doesn't matter if you're in a monarchy or a democracy or a hunter-gatherer society, you still have conversations. You still use language to influence each other, to get others to do things, to inform people, to tell stories to people, to build affiliation through narrative, these kinds of things. This is really the bottom level functions of language, and every society must be organized around those kinds of basic functions, maintaining relationships, building common understandings through narrative, sense making, these kind of basic functions for social cohesion require language in the same way. And only when you get to a higher level of how a whole population is organized and how decisions get made at a very high level, then you're talking about different kinds of societies. And I think when we look at the functions of language very closely, much of it is universal to humans, and it's not really affected that much by the kind of political type of society you live in.
Right.
But I should add, maybe what's different, you said kinds of society, but another way of thinking about that would be cultural values. And that's a bit different to how a society is organized. That's more what sort of ideas do we share and what values do we have in common. And language is absolutely central to achieving that kind of common sense making. The content of it, like actually what is conveyed, what we have in common, could be different from culture to culture. We know that some cultures value certain things and other cultures value other things. And language will be used to achieve that kind of collective focus. So in that sense, of course, you find that language has very different vocabulary. They have words for things that can't be found in other languages. So that very much reflects the sorts of value systems, I would say, that make different societies different.
Right. I guess different societies may be a wrong choice of words that I'm thinking. I meant more like different kinds of group, maybe like a group of doctors versus a group of painters will have like different speciality in their language.
Right.
A group of doctor will have like a lot of Latin words in their head to describe body parts. Painters will have like a lot of different like colors words.
Right. That's a really good point. And it shows that I think in any culture you have specialization, you have a division of labor, and you have subcultures. And so in any of those sort of specialized subcultures, of course you're going to have specific knowledge. So I simply don't know many of the things that doctors know. And so I never had to learn the words, but I know things that linguists know. So I have many words, a lot of weird vocabulary that you wouldn't, if you haven't studied linguistics, you wouldn't understand. So that's a very normal and natural kind of thing. It simply reflects what are the things that we need to talk about, or more specifically, I would say, what are the things that we need to coordinate our activities around. So I need to be able to communicate with you about various parts of the body, various physiological processes that are going on and so on. So we evolve very quickly terminology for talking about these kinds of things. You get that across cultures, so from culture to culture, often there are things that everybody is interested in, and then inside each culture there will be expertise that will, it could be something very basic like men's language might be a bit different to women's language, or older people's language might be a bit different to younger people's language, or whatever the difference might be. But in modern societies we have hyper specialized subcultures, usually because of jobs that we do. You said doctors and painters, where you can have 1,000 more professions that you could add to that list, where people might know hundreds of words that the other group doesn't know because of their expertise.
I see. And a bit jumping on another topic, I believe you mentioned in your book that the choice of language that people are using can affect their perception. And one of the examples that you gave was how color can be described in different languages. Can you explain more about that?
So color is an aspect of our visual experience. We look at things and we can see aspects of how they look. It might be shiny or dull, or we may have some kind of perception of depth and shade and so forth, brightness. But there's one sort of spectrum of wavelengths of visual input that we refer to as colour. We're all familiar with the rainbow, it shades from one different colour to the next. But there's no perfect line in a rainbow between the different colours that we might identify. So physically, our experience of colour is a gradient. Okay, and in fact, the human visual system is able to distinguish between different colours. We have, at least 1 million different differences that we can notice. So we're very sensitive to differences in colour. But, and every language will have some vocabulary for talking about those different colours. But no language has anything remotely like 1 million different words for... no language has 1 million words for anything, let alone just for colour. just have a small number, maybe a couple of dozen words that refer to different colors. So that means you have this incredibly big kind of gradient space of color experience in vision, and all languages are cutting it up into a very small number. So for each color term, each word for a color, you're getting a lot of range just within that category. So take an example like green. That if I just say my car is green, doesn't tell you is it bright green, is it dark green, is it which shade of green, is it like grass or is it like leaf? There are many different shades of green. So each category captures some part of the rainbow in some sense, but it's a wide section, so you lose a lot of information. Now, language like English has maybe a dozen basic color terms: red, green, yellow, blue, black, purple, brown, these sorts of words. And then maybe it has a whole lot more very specific words like, I don't know, scarlet and teal and these kinds of very specific turquoise terms. Many languages some languages have more than that. Many languages have less than that. Some languages that have been described to only have 3 or 4 words. So they might have something like a dark and light and warm and cool. That's how they're translated into English, but they divide up the color spectrum in different kinds of ways. So what that means is it illustrates that languages can't describe everything perfectly from our experience of the world. So they have to kind of put it into these blocks and generalize about our experience, and different languages will do this in different ways. Now, when you learn a language that has a certain color vocabulary, that might, and experiments have shown that it can affect your perception, how you view a color or whether you would identify a color with another color and group them together. So I would say in my language, blue and green are just completely separate. Lots of languages have one word which puts blue and green together, and people have difficulty identifying distinction depending on which language is their first language. So that particular illustration is a good one where language imposes. So you begin with an experience of the world, you learn a language that kind of imposes some structure on that world, and then in turn, after you've learned the language, then that sort of has an effect on your experience. There's a sense in which language then changes how we view the world.
I see. That's very interesting. I wish I could interview you more, but unfortunately we're running out of time because I only booked 1 hour in the studio. So yeah, thanks a lot for coming in today. I think I learned a lot from you, and I would like to read more of your books, your publication in the future maybe. Is Language versus Reality the latest book you have?
Yes, that's the latest book I have. It's more for a general audience. In the same year I published a book with Jack Sidnell called Consequences of Language, which is hopefully accessible, although more focused on a kind of a question of human intersubjectivity and how language plays a role in creating that human intersubjectivity. So perhaps you might enjoy that book as well.
I would get into that book. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here.